Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, our weekly look at the world of business and finance. This week, the cost of living and a dire warning from the World Bank. Millions are being driven into extreme poverty as food prices soar. We speak to the World Bank's managing director. While Iraq takes the unusual step of combating its food crisis by cancelling an order for US fighter jets. And in other business news, Nokia teams up with Microsoft. It's either a technology dream team or an attempt to survive. We look at the changing face of the technology sector. So very much a program of two halves this week, because while some of us have all we need, a lot don't. And that includes the basics, food. You know, global food prices are rising to dangerous levels, threatening tens of millions of poor people. And that's not us saying that. That's Robert Zoellick, the president of the World Bank, a group which also says the number of undernourished people in the world is now approaching 1 billion. What's really scary, though, is how quickly it is getting worse. According to the World Bank, 44 million people have been pushed into extreme poverty since June of last year. The bank defines extreme poverty as those people living on less than $1.25 a day. And between October and January, its food price index has risen 15%, making that $1.25 even more paltry. So here's how we're breaking it down this week on Counting the Cost. We've got that interview with Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who is the managing director at the World Bank. Lawrence Lee will have a report from London on the part that speculators are playing in driving up prices. And Scott Heidler's been to a commodities trading floor in Chicago to see how the whole pricing system actually works. But we're going to start in Iraq, where there is rising anger over a lack of public services and government cuts in food rations. New parliament there is grappling with a $13 billion deficit, but it was also going to buy a bunch of fighter jets from the US. Now, though, there is a change in the air. Jane Araf with this report from Baghdad.
American fighter jets or food? Looking at these protests, it's easy to see what choice the Iraqi government would make. Facing a huge budget deficit, they've announced they're delaying the purchase of 18 F-16s and will use the $900 million to help the poor. Almost daily protests here, even among the middle class, have focused on lack of services and cuts in food rations. This in a country which has some of the world's biggest oil reserves.
30% of the Iraqi people are under the poverty line. Their income is under $2 a day. How can this be justified?
Since 1991, in response to international trade sanctions that lasted more than a decade, the Iraqi government has provided every citizen with food at virtually no cost. It's basic stuff: rice, flour, cooking oil. But millions of the poor depend on it. With the budget problems, corruption, and mismanagement, those rations have been getting smaller and smaller. And Iraqis have been getting angrier and angrier. There's no water, no electricity for 15 days. Flour stopped 5 months ago. There's no sugar, there's no tea, says Zahra Hussein, a widow who supports 10 people. F-16s like these, sold last year to Pakistan, were to have been at the center of a new Iraqi Air Force, which would eventually be able to defend Iraq's airspace. The head of Parliament's Economic Committee, a member of the opposition Iraqi bloc, says if it weren't for corruption, Iraqis could afford the fighter jets.
In the previous budget, billions of dollars were assigned for the ration card, but because of a layer of politicians and ministry employees who regretfully did not deal with this money honestly, the ration system almost collapsed.
The United States had been counting on the contract as a continued foothold in Iraq, as well as a boost to its defense industry. The Iraqi military had hoped to rebuild its air force, but so far it's not Iraqi pilots who are demonstrating in the streets.
And now to the two reports we mentioned earlier. In a moment, the mechanics of the commodities market with Scott Heidler in Chicago. First, though, the increasing accusations that the very same banks, the hedge funds, the financiers whose speculation caused the subprime mortgage crisis, and we know what that did, they're the ones apparently causing food prices to yo-yo and inflate. Lawrence Lee has more on that.
There are lots of things which lead to food shortages. Floods, fire, drought, civil unrest are all assumed to cause hunger and misery for the poorest in the world. What's less well known is the extent to which the actions of some of the world's richest money men compound problems which are already bad enough. This street is in one of London's richest areas, Mayfair. This anonymous building houses a hedge fund, which is an investment vehicle for millionaires. Here, the actions of just a few people had global implications. One day last year, the people who work in the hedge fund here had a brilliant idea. They bought 240,000 tonnes of cocoa on the London commodities market, 7% of the world's supply. Having cornered the market, they then simply stored all the cocoa in warehouses. The price of chocolate reached its highest level for more than 30 years. This is how prices of wheat and grain have risen so much. The hedge fund wouldn't talk to us, but a few are prepared to break the code of silence among traders. This man used to work in the City of London, but then appeared anonymously in newspaper columns, becoming famous by blowing the whistle on the behaviour of the financial markets.
To them, food is just an asset, just like an equity or a bond or anything else like that, or a currency, and they have no regard whatsoever that for other people it's whether they live or die. So it really, I'm afraid, is a ruthless place, and there is a general cynicism in the city and in finance generally.
Deregulation of the commodities markets has meant the same financial institutions which caused the financial crash now trade staple foods which keep much of the world from starvation, just like oil or gold. Whenever there's a crisis, like a flood or a drought, traders bet against the price of food going up or down. Critics say they systematically distort prices to make money.
In moral terms, I would describe their behavior as completely immoral. Every economic decision does have a moral consequence, and the bankers' actions don't pay attention to what happens on the ground as food prices go up. Food is a fundamental human right. It's not a commodity to be bought and sold like any other.
It's an open question whether proposed banking reforms could stop commodity speculation from turning crises into potential disasters. But one thing is certain. In places like Tunisia or Algeria, hungry people cause civil unrest. And that in itself should be enough for Western governments to worry.
We're here on the floor of the CME Group where commodities are traded, agricultural commodities are traded. And to get a better perspective of this, we're joined by David Hightower. Now, he's been doing this, he's been in this line of work for 30 years. Now, David, explain to us how food prices, agricultural commodities, can be affected by extreme weather around the world, say like a flood in Pakistan or a flood in Australia. How does that affect how commodities are traded on this floor here in Chicago?
Well, we're trying to determine the future price for people that use these commodities. A lot of planning goes into putting these supplies where they need to be, when they need to be. And so this is somewhat a clearinghouse for information from the world. Information flows in and out of these pits, but more and more information is coming from around the globe. They're trying to help us determine what the value of those commodities are. And when you have a little bit of a threat from the weather, then we have to charge more for the commodities, we have to ration demand, we have to make sure we can get other alternatives in place if need be.
Right, and when you're talking specifically things like corn and soybean products that obviously have a direct impact when there's extreme weather around the world.
Correct, and it's a different situation in the last 2.5 years. We've had a number of minor issues, but demand has been consistently outstripping supply. So it didn't take as much of a weather threat or as much of a supply threat for prices to begin to escalate. Now, this also comes on the back of a much higher cost of production.
Now, what of those commodities, the agricultural commodities, have the biggest impact? Is it corn? Is it soybeans?
It's coming from the food groups. It's coming from the industrial commodities. So that just shows us it's not in one area. It's supplies tight everywhere, and the world is really now coming to grips with the fact they haven't put enough investment. It's not speculation, it's investment in order to try and get that food in place for the world.